Welcome to the latest installment of Don't Take This as Gospel. I'm Mike Partika, and previously I was reviewing the book The Rational Bible, Exodus, God, Slavery, and Freedom by Dennis Prager. That review has concluded as of the last video. Most of the end of the Exodus story had to do with the construction of the temple, and so there wasn't a whole lot of meat to get a lot of things for. There's some additional content like the creation of the golden calf incident, which you might remember from the movie The Ten Commandments, but there just wasn't a whole heck of a lot that I wanted to comment on from that. So I'm done with that book. Wanted to move to something completely different. I went to Stefan Molyneux's book, Universally Preferable Behaviour, a Rational Guide to Secular Ethics. So I've switched from a religious book to an atheist book, and let's see what we can glean out of that. Well, unfortunately, not a whole heck of a lot. The book was written in 2007 by Stefan Molyneux, who is a philosopher. He's the host of Free Domain Radio. He does weekly shows and call-ins. And he's been developing his ideas on secular ethics for quite a while now. And all of his materials available for free on Free Domain Radio. I will provide you with the affiliate link to his book, Universally Preferable Behavior, on Amazon. But what I want to kind of deal with, I'm not going to deal so much with the ideas in the book, because I think he has some very interesting ideas, and he makes a very rigorous logical proof for his ideas. And the one thing that just kind of grates up against all of this is, can it really be done? If you're not familiar with Stefan Molyneux, that's probably because he got kicked off of YouTube recently and you can't find him anywhere except for on alternative media like BitChute, Odyssey, Rumble, and some other platforms. So you're going to have to look for him on alt tech as opposed to mainstream tech. And the issues around which he got booted, there's no need to go into, and I won't be bringing up anything regarding that in here. What has always fascinated me about him is his radical ideas about government, the power of the state, the moral legitimacy of the state, and what kind of society human beings ideally ought to be able to form. And also this notion of universally preferable behavior, which is a moral framework, a rationally guided ethical framework by which you can judge the morality of various behaviors. And it comes out with all the expected results, like murder is wrong, theft is wrong, rape is wrong, assault is wrong, things like that. But it also expands out into wider fields of life, like into the realms of parenting, into the realms of governance, and tries to apply the same rules in the macro that it does in the micro, because that's what it takes to be a logically consistent ethical framework, is that the rules can't change when you scale up. That's one of his major arguments. Now, I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to try and take issue with the ideas themselves. What I just want to cover is whether or not it's a good book. And because I had a lot of high hopes for this book. I was kind of expecting something that was going to be on the level of, say, one of Dennis Prager's other books, The Ten Commandments, Still the Best Moral Code. He's got a book out covering the Ten Commandments. Covers a lot of the ideas that he covers in the Rational Bible, Exodus, God, Slavery, and Freedom. And so I was wondering if Universally Preferable Behavior was going to be a book that ended up being like the Ten Commandments, but with a bottom-up rational framework for those ethics as opposed to a top-down authoritarian command. And that is what it attempts to be. And maybe somewhere in all of the content of the book, it accomplishes that. But that's hard to say because so much of the book is dedicated to what I would call off-topic stuff, like, number one, debunking religion. if you're creating a book on secular ethics, why do you even need to mention religion? That's kind of a, not a goes without saying so much as a why even bother talking about it subject. Because all you're going to do at that point is alienate the people who are religious. Likewise, there's a lot of government debunking. And by that I mean that when you come down to the conclusions of universally preferable behavior, you come to the conclusions that the state is an immoral non-entity which has no place in human life, which is why he is, in addition to being a philosopher, an anarchist. He professes to be an anarcho-capitalist. And anarchy does not mean there are no rules, it just means that there are no rulers, that all of human interaction ought to be voluntary, consensual interaction to the extent that consent and voluntarism is possible. And in such a framework, there is no need and there cannot ethically be a place for institutions like the state, because the state is essentially grounded in the monopolized use of force and the legitimizing of the use of force in order to confiscate resources. Now, here's the problem with his book. His book kind of starts off from that delegitimizing standpoint. It kind of like saying, okay, here's all the bad ways we've tried to impose ethics. We've used religion and we've used government. And here's all the terrible things that have come from that. And wouldn't it be better if we had some sort of secular framework? But he spends a good 30 pages in that of a 134-page book. Now, if a quarter of your book just basically starts from the idea of, here's what we've got to cover in order for me to prepare you for what's to come, the good stuff, it's not a good look, because for one thing, he's got a very caustic style. He's not one who minces words. He's not one who softens blows. He has no problem just flat out telling you that your beliefs are nonsense. And when you are trying to create a secular framework that is independent of God or the state for any kind of moral value, I don't think it's a wise tactic to be antagonistic towards those things that people have largely come to depend on, as if you've already guaranteed your payoff in advance. Like, I'm going to totally tear down your world, but don't worry, just trust me that I'm going to have built something up by the time I get done with the book to make all of this tearing down of civilization worthwhile. Now, of course, he's tearing down civilization in the hopes of making a better civilization, so let's not, basically say that tearing down civilization is bad in this respect. It's more of a reform as opposed to a dissolution or destruction. But here's how I think the book should be structured. The book should be structured starting with the argument for universally preferable behavior itself, without going on the attack, without having to throw slings and arrows at religion and government and things that we generally take for granted. Because what you want to establish first is that there is some sort of scaffolding that you can transition over onto. Because let's understand, civilization is built upon all of our past accomplishments, and whether those past accomplishments have been hobbled by institutions that are may turn out to be morally illegitimate, then you still have to realize that people are standing on the backs of those institutions still. And they're not going to let go of the tree branch that they're desperately clinging onto, no matter how warped and deformed the tree, if it's still keeping them out of the lava pit. You have to first build the platform under them so that they can let go and they know they're going to land on something. And that's what universally preferable behavior fails to do for the large part. at least in the way that it's structured, the book in the way that it's structured. Instead, it's like it chops at the base of the tree, and then what are you left with? You're left with not wanting to believe the arguments because you haven't been giving anything good to stand on first. So it's a bad way to structure a book. As for universally preferable behavior itself, the one thing I will say is that, well, I'll say a couple of things. It ends up winding up being kind of like a 12-point step of rational analysis of moral situations, and you can, like, if you drop some sort of moral situation into the meat grinder of UPB, then when you get through all 12 steps, you should have an evaluation of whether or not that act is moral or not. Now, for a very, very basic hypothetical framework, that's fine. But in practical reality, you need better than that. And I don't think the book serves well to do that. For example, let me bring into the example of mathematics. In mathematics, like in geometry, what I remember from high school geometry, you start with 5 hypotheses. And these 5 hypotheses are just things that you take for granted. But if you take these 5 things for granted, then you can start making logical and rational deductions, and you build a superstructure on top of the original structure. Maybe that's not the right way to say superstructure versus structure, but you are building on the foundation of the hypotheses these theorems that are made up of proofs that use the hypotheses. Like, if you have these 5 hypotheses and maybe another hypothesis or 2, eventually you can get to the point where you say that the angles in a rhombus are perpendicular, or if you add them up, or something like that. It's been a while. I've been out of high school for, 30 years, so have pity on me for not remembering that off the top of my head. We generally work on a moral basis at the theorem level. We don't have to reason out why stealing is wrong. We just accept that stealing is wrong. And a lot of us accept that as something axiomatic in and of itself. Now, what Stefan Molyneux is proposing is that you can go even deeper than that and not take stealing is wrong as being axiomatic, but you can take common sense observations about the world and build from that stealing is wrong, so long as you accept all of the hypotheses, which he gives rational proofs for. Well, not rational proofs for, but basically says that these things have to be self-evident, or else everything we know about observing the world and working in the world is wrong. So if you get into one of these self-contradictory kind of messes, then you know that your system is bad. But if your system is logically consistent, then anything you build on that will be logically consistent, and you can trust it on that account. It's not as powerful or compelling an argument as, thou shalt not steal. I mean, just on its surface. And maybe that's because we're more used to thou shalt not steal, as opposed to stealing is wrong because it violates both the non-aggression principle and the principle of universality, etc., etc. We don't ascribe moral worth to the presuppositions on which he's building universally preferable behavior. We know that there is a moral worth to thou shalt not steal, but the idea that a principle ought to be universally applied, that's not something that we necessarily ascribe moral worth to. We're not used to doing it anyway. Maybe it's something we should ascribe moral worth to, but that we have to kind of work at the level that we're at, as opposed to the level necessarily that he would like us to be at. Because a lot of universally preferable behavior relies upon your understanding all of these bottom level concepts. And he even recognizes the trouble with this when he says in his book, it takes a person of a higher intellectual capacity to fully grasp universally preferable behavior at its foundational level, and especially then to work outward from that into all of the behaviors that we would therefore prohibit on account of that foundation. But I would say that the overwhelming population of the planet doesn't work at that kind of level. And so expecting them to accept your views on morality based on a level that they, a level of thought that they are generally not going to attain to, if all you do is give them the foundation and then say, okay, we're going to build a society from that, you can't really get anywhere, because most people are going to need you to formulate for them the theorems and not just give them the hypotheses so that they can make the theorems for themselves. It's kind of like, you can give me all the tools to build a table, but if you don't instruct me, and maybe mentor me, and maybe just basically write out the IKEA list of directions saying, here's how you get from this mass assembly of materials into a table, then I'm not going to be able to do it. And I'm not talking about even intellectual capacity at that point. I'm just talking about my ability to reason together a table, or instinctively know how the pieces of this table are supposed to go together and what screws go where and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, there is I think the big fault of the book, Universally Preferable Behavior, is that it never really gets beyond that the hypothesis level, and this is probably by design, because he wants you to take this hypothesis and then test it for yourself and then make your theorems and see if you come out with the same theorems he does, etc., etc. See if you get the kind of society that he's envisioning. Now, what I will say is that he does do a decent job of at least introducing some of his more radical ideas toward the end of the book about how we should not be living in a state-run society, but we should be living in a voluntaristic society where all of our interactions are voluntary. He doesn't go into, the full-blown, what does this society look like kind of, utopia vision, because that's beyond the scope of the book. I think he's got a couple other books that I'll read at some later point called Practical Anarchy and Everyday Anarchy. I think those are the names of his books. And you can check them out on his website, Free Domain Radio. Or not Free Domain Radio, freedomain.com. I think he changed the website a few years back. So those are the most interesting and the most challenging things. How do you parent if the non-aggression principle takes spanking off the table? How do you govern if the non-aggression principle or universally preferable behavior takes the use of force and the ability to assign the right to use force to police and to the army, and it takes off the table the ability to tax without your voluntary consent. How do you run a society that way? These are all very challenging ideas, and I think they're ideas worth exploring, because, like he says, there was a time way back in not way back really, just a couple hundred years ago, when people were thinking to themselves, how are we supposed to have a society without slavery? I mean, duh, you've got to have slavery to run a society. Well, as it turned out, no, you don't. At least that's what we've seemed to have determined so far. So if that was a seeming impossibility back then, that you couldn't have, civilization without slavery, and now we know we can, well, maybe we're in that same state now, where we're being told that we can't have civilization without government, or without even the most voluntaristic forms of government, like democracy, which he would still maintain is not voluntaristic at all, on account of majority rules overriding the will of the minority, and so it's not voluntaristic on the part of the minority. If you if you previously saw this one version of society that nobody thought could happen come into being, well, maybe this other version of society that he's positing can also come into being. One where there is, peaceful parenting. One where there is no governments, no states. One where there is, no religion. But the way that his book kind of gets to that vision is a very antagonistic and very rigorous and very methodical, very well thought out, but abrasive and caustic process, so that by the time you get to his more challenging ideas at the end, you don't really have a sense that this is necessarily anywhere you want to go, just on account of all the ways you've been rubbed the wrong way up to that point. And also the fact that you're left with this 12-point plan for universally preferable behavior, where you have to figure out everything for yourself, which, anybody who's really looking to a book of secular ethics, or a book of ethics just in general, you kind of want people to have worked out some of the stuff for you. And maybe that's morally lazy, maybe that's, intellectual laziness. But again, he seems to recognize that on his own when he says that it takes a higher intellectual capacity to recognize the validity and the applications of universally preferable behavior. And so I think one of the major challenges that he has yet to answer is, how do you establish the axiom so that it will boil down to, thou shalt not assault, thou shalt not murder, or thou shalt not rape, thou shalt not steal, and basically say, we can't have a society without these theorems, and just trust that, at the bottom the math works, because that's what a lot of people are going to do. As much as his goal is to present an anti-authoritarian system, if you don't have the quote-unquote math skills to turn those hypotheses into the theorems, then you're just going to have to put the weight of authority behind the moral theorems and convince people to go on that. And so, the practical application of universally preferable behavior, I don't know how well it's going to work out in the world, but I think the main point of his book is that we should give it a chance. And I think he would come across as more convincing in that point if he were to take a lot of the antagonism toward existing systems out of the book and just say, here's the system, here's how it works out, all of the things that you take for granted already, such as these kind of things are wrong, while preserving the rightness of certain other things, and then challenging people with a view of, here's where the logical implications of the system go, and yes, that does contradict what we're used to, but just because it's different doesn't mean it's wrong. In fact, it may be even better than what we've got now, and shouldn't we therefore give it a try? I think a book that was written in that kind of vein is really the kind of book that we need. But unfortunately, Universally Preferable Behavior, the book as it is written now, is just not that book. So I guess to summarize, I'm not saying that the ideas in the book are bad, but I do think that the structure of the book makes the book a bad package for those ideas. It is a book direly in need of a rewrite. And I think I'll leave it at that. So, thank you for listening to this installment of Don't Take This as Gospel. I'm Mike Partika. Please subscribe. I don't know exactly what I'll be covering next. I would like to actually touch on a more modern religion than probably one of the most modern religions to have come into being. But I also do have Dennis Prager's next book in the Rational Bible series, which is Genesis, God, Creation, and Destruction. So I'm kind of just wavering between the two. So I think what I'll do is I'll review some material from the series that I'm looking at, and if it looks like it's interesting stuff, I'll maybe make a couple of videos on that, and then I'll get back into Dennis Prager's series, because I do think that this coming year we're looking at the third book in the Rational Bible series, which will be on Deuteronomy, and I'm probably going to get all five of his books, just because number one, I have some low grade OCD, and I just can't pass up getting a set. But also he's got interesting insights. He's managed to pull out some things that I hadn't thought of, and I look forward to seeing more of that. But that has been my review of Stefan Molyneux's Universally Preferable Behavior. Again, if you'd like, you can pick up your own copy at the Amazon affiliate link that I provided in the video description. And I hope you've enjoyed this broadcast. Please do subscribe so that if you can be notified of future videos. And I will talk to you later.